Montana Territory, December 1889. The wind screamed across the Bitterroot Valley with a violence that made seasoned frontiersmen nervous. Winter was coming early, and it promised to be brutal. In a clearing 3 miles north of Stevensville, a solitary figure worked against the fading light, hauling timber onto an already completed roof. His neighbors watched from their cabins, shaking their heads. "He's building a second roof," someone muttered. "The man's lost his mind." Lars Nieminen didn't respond to the whispers. He simply measured, cut, and nailed, constructing what looked like madness to everyone watching. But what they didn't know was that this foolish Finn understood something about heat loss that would soon mean the difference between survival and suffering. Before we reveal what Lars knew that his neighbors didn't, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why this crazy technique is actually genius engineering. And you might just want to try it yourself. The question isn't whether Lars's double roof worked. The question is, why did it work so much better than anyone expected? Lars Nieminen arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1887, carrying little more than a woodworking kit and memories of Finnish winters that could freeze spit before it hit the ground. He claimed a homestead in the Bitterroot Valley, 160 acres of mixed pine and grassland that the land office clerk said might support cattle if you're lucky. By autumn of 1889, Lars had built himself a serviceable cabin, 16 by 20 feet, notched log construction, a stone hearth on the north wall. Nothing remarkable until October, when he started building what appeared to be a second roof directly above the first. The structure baffled his neighbors. Thomas Whitmer, who owned the adjacent quarter section, rode over to investigate. "What in God's name are you doing, Lars?" "Making roof," Lars replied in his accented English, gesturing at the framework taking shape 8 inches above his existing shingle roof. "You already have a roof," Whitmer said. "A good one. Why would you waste timber and labor building another?" Lars tried to explain something about air and cold and the way heat escaped, but Whitmer rode off, shaking his head. By evening, half the valley knew the Finn had gone strange. Probably the isolation. Maybe he'd taken a knock to the head. James Bradley, a carpenter who'd built 6 cabins in the valley, was more direct when he visited 3 days later. "You're doubling your structural load for no reason," he said, examining Lars's work. "That gap you're leaving, 8 inches of nothing, that's wasted space. No insulation value whatsoever." "Air is insulation," Lars said quietly. Bradley laughed. "Air? Son, air is what steals your heat. You want insulation, you pack that space with moss or grass or dirt. Something solid. This double roof nonsense is going to cost you timber, time, and warmth when winter hits." But Lars had already calculated the cost. Back in Oulu, in northern Finland, he'd seen variations of this technique used on storage buildings and saunas. The principle was simple. Trapped air, when properly sealed and vented, created a thermal barrier that solid materials couldn't match. The key was the gap, wide enough to prevent conduction, narrow enough to prevent convection. By mid-November, Lars had finished his double roof. The upper roof sat on a framework of small poles, creating an 8-inch air space above the lower roof. He'd built ventilation slots at the eaves and ridge, barely noticeable gaps that would allow moisture to escape while keeping the dead air space stable. His neighbors called it Nieminen's folly. Some predicted the structure would collapse under the first heavy snow. Others said he'd wasted enough good timber to build a barn. The consensus was clear. Lars didn't understand Montana winters, and he was going to learn the hard way. What they didn't understand was that Lars had survived winters where temperatures regularly dropped to 40 below zero. And in those frozen Finnish landscapes, his grandfather had taught him a simple truth. The best insulation isn't what you put between you and the cold. It's the air you trap there. The physics behind Lars's double roof were elegant in their simplicity, though few of his neighbors possessed the education to understand them. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Lars's design attacked all 3. Conduction, the direct transfer of heat through solid materials, was the enemy of every frontier cabin. When warm interior air heated the ceiling, that heat conducted directly through wooden boards and shingles to the frozen air outside. It was like throwing firewood directly into a snowbank. Lars's 8-inch air gap eliminated this pathway. Heat rising from his cabin warmed the lower roof, but that warmth couldn't conduct through 8 inches of air to reach the upper roof. The gap created a thermal break, a buffer zone where heat transfer simply stopped. Convection, the movement of air carrying heat away, was equally problematic in traditional roofs. As warm air rose and touched cold ceiling boards, it cooled, sank, and created circulation patterns that constantly pulled warmth away from living spaces. Lars's sealed air gap prevented this. The dead air space between his two roofs couldn't circulate. It sat there, inert and invisible, getting gradually warmer but never moving. He'd calculated the gap width carefully. Too narrow, say 3 inches, and the air could still transfer some heat through microconvection. Too wide, 15 inches or more, and the airspace itself would begin to circulate, creating internal convection currents that would compromise the insulation value. 8 inches was the sweet spot, wide enough to prevent conduction, narrow enough to prevent convection. The ventilation slots were his masterstroke. Many frontier builders, attempting primitive double walls or roofs, sealed their air gaps completely and ended up with condensation problems that rotted their structures from within. Lars understood that the air space needed to breathe. The tiny gaps at eaves and ridge allowed moisture vapor to escape while maintaining the thermal barrier. "Where did you learn this?" asked Henry Morrison, a younger homesteader who'd watched the construction with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "My grandfather," Lars said, running his hand along the smooth underside of his lower roof. "In Finland, we build summer kitchens with double roofs. Keeps them cool when sun is hot. Same principle works for keeping warm when air is cold." Morrison frowned. "But that's backwards. Keeping cool and keeping warm, those are opposite problems." "No," Lars said. "Same problem. Both about stopping heat from moving where you don't want it to go. In summer, stop heat from coming in. In winter, stop heat from going out. The air gap does both." The total cost of Lars's double roof system was 34 board feet of additional timber, 16 pounds of nails, and 4 full days of labor. His neighbors, still skeptical, calculated that he could have spent that time in material building a proper barn or cutting firewood for winter. James Bradley, passing by in early December, called up to Lars as he made final adjustments to the ridge vent. "You'll regret this when you're burning twice the wood to keep warm, and that top-heavy structure is groaning under 3 feet of snow." Lars said nothing. He simply descended his ladder, banked his fire for the night, and went to bed under his foolish double roof. The real test was coming, and it would prove more brutal than even Lars had anticipated. James Bradley wasn't a cruel man, but he was a confident one. He'd built structures across 3 territories, and he understood wood, weight, and winter. When he looked at Lars Nieminen's double roof, he saw engineering ignorance, the kind of mistake an immigrant makes when he doesn't understand American conditions. On a cold December afternoon, Bradley organized what amounted to an informal technical review. He brought Thomas Whitmer, Frank Jessup, who'd done some engineering work for the railroad, and 2 other experienced builders to Lars's cabin. The stated purpose was offering friendly advice. The real purpose was proving Lars wrong before he influenced other settlers. "Let's start with structural integrity," Bradley said, standing beside Lars's cabin with his arms crossed. "You've added roughly 400 pounds of additional roofing material. That's 400 pounds your walls weren't designed to support. First heavy snow, say 3 feet of wet snow in March, you're looking at another 800 pounds minimum. That's over half a ton of extra load on a structure built for maybe a quarter of that." Lars listened quietly. "Second issue," Frank Jessup added, warming to the subject. "Thermal efficiency. Heat rises, correct? So your warmest air is hitting that lower roof. But instead of a single barrier between warm and cold, you've created 2 barriers with dead space between them. That dead space doesn't insulate. It's just nothing. You'd have been better off with a single roof packed with 6 inches of sod. Sod is heavy too, Lars noted. Sure, but sod actually works, Bradley said. It has mass, thermal mass. It absorbs heat and releases it slowly. Your air gap? It's at no thermal mass. It can't store anything. You're relying on emptiness to keep you warm, and that's not how physics works. The gathering attracted other neighbors. Several men nodded along with Bradley's explanations. The logic seemed sound. Solid insulation had to be better than empty air. Look, Bradley continued, his tone almost sympathetic, I understand you're trying to adapt techniques from Finland. But Montana isn't Finland. Our winters are different, drier. The altitude changes things. What works in a Finnish sauna isn't going to work in a Montana cabin. We will see, Lars said simply. Bradley mistook Lars's brevity for capitulation. I'm not trying to embarrass you, he said. I'm trying to save you from a cold winter and a potentially dangerous structural failure. It's not too late to tear down that upper roof and do this properly. I'll even help you reframe it with proper insulation. Lars shook his head. Thank you, no. I'll wait for winter. The gathering dispersed with a mixture of pity and frustration. Bradley genuinely believed he'd try to help. As he rode away, he told Whitmer, that man's pride is going to freeze him half to death. When he comes asking for help in January, we'll do what we can. But some lessons have to be learned the hard way. What Bradley didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Lars wasn't being stubborn. He was being patient. He knew his double roof worked because he'd seen the principle proven across 100 Finnish winters. The air gap wasn't theoretical. It wasn't experimental. It was tested technology that his neighbors simply didn't recognize. Lars spent the rest of December cutting firewood. Not because he expected to burn more than usual, but because he expected to burn less, and he wanted a surplus to share when his neighbors ran short. He stacked the wood with the calm confidence of a man who knew what was coming. And what was coming would vindicate everything his neighbors called foolish. The cold arrived on January 8, 1890, with a silence that frightened experienced frontiersmen. No wind, no clouds, just clear, crystalline air that seemed to pull heat from everything it touched. By January 10th, temperatures at the Stevensville trading post registered 12 degrees below zero at noon. By evening, it had dropped to minus 22. The cold wasn't the howling, dramatic freeze of a blizzard. It was the quiet, relentless cold that killed livestock and cracked trees like rifle shots in the night. Thomas Whitmer's wife woke him at 2 a.m. on January 11th. The water bucket is frozen solid, she said. Inside the cabin, Whitmer stoked his fire until the hearth glowed orange, feeding it log after log. The interior temperature climbed to maybe 38 degrees, barely above freezing. His children huddled under every blanket they owned. The single-pane window had frost on the inside, so thick he couldn't see out. By dawn on January 12th, the cold had intensified beyond anything the valley had experienced in living memory. The official thermometer at the trading post froze and stopped functioning, but later estimates, based on alcohol thermometers and comparative records, put the temperature at minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. James Bradley's cabin, despite his expertise in careful construction, couldn't hold heat. He burned wood so fast his wife worried they'd run out before the cold broke. The interior temperature fluctuated between 15 and 20 degrees, even with the fire roaring continuously. Frost formed on the nails protruding through the ceiling boards. Hundreds of tiny points of ice where metal conducted cold directly into the living space. Frank Jessup wrapped his children in blankets and buffalo robes and kept them within 3 feet of the hearth. The far corners of his cabin registered below zero. Ice formed in the cracks between logs. His wife's breath frosted invisible clouds, even though they had a fire hot enough to make the stone hearth uncomfortable to stand near. If you're watching this and thinking about that double roof right now, hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because what happened next changed how frontier families thought about shelter. Drop a comment telling me, would you have believed Lars, or would you have called him foolish? The crisis deepened on January 13th. 3 families, burning through their winter wood supply at catastrophic rates, sent men to neighbors asking to share warmth and shelter. No one had enough. The cold had exceeded every preparation, every calculation, every precaution. Thomas Whitmer, desperate for solutions, remembered Lars Nieminen, the quiet Finn who lived 3 miles north, the fool who'd built a second roof. Whitmer bundled in every piece of clothing he owned and rode north through air so cold his horse's breath crystallized instantly into clouds of ice particles. When he reached Lars's clearing, he expected to find a man in crisis, maybe already suffering from hypothermia, too proud to ask for help. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. Smoke rose lazily from Lars's chimney, not the thick, constant smoke of a fire burning desperately to stay ahead of the cold. Just normal, steady smoke. Whitmer approached the cabin cautiously. Through the window, clear of frost, he could see Lars sitting at his table, calmly working on what looked like a wood-carving project. Whitmer knocked. Lars opened the door, wearing a single wool shirt. No coat. The wave of warmth that escaped was so dramatic Whitmer actually gasped. "Thomas," Lars said calmly. "Come in. It's cold outside." Thomas Whitmer stepped into Lars Nieminen's cabin and felt heat, actual, comfortable warmth, envelope him for the first time in 3 days. His frost-burned cheeks began to sting as blood flow returned. He stood there, speechless, while Lars calmly closed the door. "You look cold," Lars observed. "Coffee." "Ow," Whitmer managed. "How is it this warm?" Lars gestured toward the hearth. A modest fire burned there, nothing like the roaring infernos Whitmer and his neighbors had been maintaining. "Same amount of wood," Lars said. "Maybe less." Whitmer pulled off his glove and touched the log wall. It was cool to the touch, but not frozen. He looked up at the ceiling. No frost on the nails. No ice forming at the corners. He'd been inside hundreds of cabins, and in cold like this, you always saw the signs. The white patches where moisture froze, the crystals forming along the ceiling edges where warm met cold. Lars's cabin had none of that. "The temperature," Whitmer said. "Do you have a thermometer?" Lars nodded and retrieved a mercury thermometer he'd mail-ordered from a scientific supply company in Denver. He hung it on a nail in the center of the cabin, away from the direct heat of the fire. 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Whitmer stared at it. "That's impossible. My cabin, with twice the fire you're running, barely reaches 17, maybe 20 degrees on a good day." "Air gap," Lars said simply, pointing upward. "Heat goes up, yes. Hits lower roof, but cannot go through 8 inches of air to reach upper roof. So heat stays inside. Your cabin, heat goes through boards, through shingles, into cold air. Heat leaves fast. Mine leaves slow." Over the next hour, Lars explained the principle in detail. Whitmer, who dismissed it as nonsense 6 weeks earlier, now listened with the intensity of a man whose survival might depend on understanding. "The double roof creates what you might call a thermal shield," Lars said. "Your roof, single layer, it tries to fight the cold directly. My roof, the upper roof is cold, yes. Maybe same temperature as outside. But that cold cannot reach the lower roof because of the air gap. The lower roof stays warm, maybe 30, 35 degrees. Not hot, but not frozen. And that means inside stays much warmer." Whitmer did rough calculations in his head. Lars's cabin was approximately the same size as his own. Similar log construction, similar hearth. The only significant difference was the double roof. And that difference had produced a 37-degree temperature advantage. "I need James Bradley to see this," Whitmer said, "and Frank Jessup, and everyone who told you this wouldn't work." Lars poured coffee. "Bring them tomorrow. Bring families if they need a warm place to stay. I have space." Word spread through the valley faster than the cold had. By the afternoon of January 14th, 11 men had visited Lars's cabin, each bringing his own thermometer to verify what seemed impossible. The measurements were consistent, 52 to 56 degrees Fahrenheit inside, with outdoor temperatures still hovering around -28. James Bradley arrived last, brought by Henry Morrison. He stood inside Lars's cabin with the stunned expression of a man whose expertise had just been proven inadequate. He touched the walls, examined the ceiling, studied the modest fire in the hearth. "I was wrong," he said finally. "Completely wrong. This is remarkable." Lars nodded. "Physics doesn't change with geography. Same in Finland. Same in Montana. Air, when you trap it right, is very good insulation. The most striking comparison came from Frank Jessup, who'd kept careful records. His cabin, which he'd designed himself using railroad engineering principles, had consumed approximately 42 cords of firewood during the cold snap just to maintain 15 to 20 degrees. Lars had burned 17 cords and maintained 54 degrees. The thermal efficiency wasn't just better. It was transformatively better. Lars's double roof hadn't just worked. It had outperformed every traditional design by a margin that defied the experts' expectations. That night, with temperatures still brutally cold, 3 families accepted Lars's invitation to shelter in his cabin. They brought bedrolls and crowded into a small space. With 15 people and 1 modest fire, the interior temperature actually rose to 61 degrees. "Tomorrow," Bradley said quietly, "I'd like to learn how to build one of these. If you'll teach me." Lars smiled. "We start after cold breaks. But yes, I teach. This is not secret. This is just good engineering." The cold snap broke on January 18th, 1890. Temperatures climbed back to a merely frigid 10 degrees above zero, and the Bitterroot Valley began assessing the damage. 2 homesteaders had lost significant portions of their winter wood supply. One family's cabin had suffered structural damage from the relentless freeze-thaw cycling around their inadequate hearth. Several livestock hadn't survived, but Lars Nieminen's cabin stood unchanged, and his wood supply remained abundant. Within a week, James Bradley had drawn detailed plans based on Lars's design. He refined the measurements, creating standardized specifications: 8-inch air gap, ventilation slots measuring 3/4 of an inch at 12-inch intervals along the eaves and ridge, support framework using poles no less than 3 inches in diameter. By late February, Bradley had begun construction on the valley's second double roof cabin. This one for Henry Morrison, who'd been the first to show genuine interest in Lars's technique. Morrison documented the construction process carefully, noting that the additional cost was approximately 15% more timber and perhaps 20% more labor compared to a traditional roof. For a 37-degree temperature advantage, Morrison said, "That's not cost. That's the bargain of a lifetime." The design spread rapidly. Thomas Whitmer rebuilt his roof in March. Frank Jessup completed his double roof conversion in April. By the autumn of 1890, 11 cabins within a 20-mile radius had adopted Lars's design. By spring of 1891, that number had grown to 23. The technique wasn't limited to roofs. Several builders began experimenting with double wall construction using the same air gap principle. Results varied. Walls were more complex than roofs, with more opportunities for air leakage. But the successful implementations showed temperature improvements of 15 to 20 degrees over single-wall designs. Lars became something of a local expert, consulted on thermal efficiency and insulation principles. He never charged for advice. "In Finland, we share knowledge," he explained. "What worked for one family works for all families. Cold doesn't care about property lines." James Bradley, to his credit, became one of Lars's strongest advocates. He wrote a detailed article for the territorial newspaper describing the double roof principle, complete with diagrams and thermal performance data. The article concluded, "We dismissed as primitive ignorance what was, in fact, sophisticated engineering refined over centuries of Arctic survival. Mr. Nieminen's folly has proven to be wisdom we were too arrogant to recognize." The double roof design earned a nickname in the valley, Finnish Insurance. As in, got your Finnish insurance yet? It became a point of pride, a marker that separated practical, informed builders from those still relying on traditional methods. Interestingly, the principle wasn't unique to Finland. As word spread and more settlers shared their knowledge, it emerged that variations of the air gap insulation concept existed across multiple cold climate cultures. Norwegian settlers mentioned similar techniques. Russian immigrants described double wall ovens. Indigenous peoples of the northern plains had long understood that layered shelter with air pockets provided superior insulation. The convergent evolution of the idea across disparate cultures suggested something profound. When humans face extreme cold with limited resources, they eventually discover the same physical principles. The air gap wasn't Finnish or Norwegian or Russian. It was physics waiting to be understood by anyone willing to observe and experiment. Modern building science has vindicated Lars's intuition completely. Today's structural insulated panels, SIPs, double-envelope houses, and advanced thermal break systems all rely on the same fundamental principle. Trapped air is one of nature's best insulators. An inch of still air has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, comparable to an inch of many solid insulation materials. The key is preventing that air from moving. Contemporary building codes now mandate air gaps in roof assemblies, though they're typically achieved through different methods: radiant barriers, ventilated attic spaces, insulation layers. But the principle Lars brought from Finland in 1887 remains at the heart of efficient thermal design. If this story changed how you think about primitive or traditional knowledge, show it by hitting that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me, what other old techniques do you think might actually be brilliant engineering? And hit that like button if you believe wisdom doesn't have an expiration date. Lars Nieminen lived in his double-roof cabin until 1912, when he sold his homestead and moved to Missoula to live with his daughter's family. The cabin still stood as of 1935, when a Forest Service survey noted it as structurally sound, double-roof design, Finnish construction. Its ultimate fate is unrecorded, but its influence persisted long after Lars himself had passed. The story of Lars's roof offers a lesson that extends beyond thermal engineering. It reminds us that mockery is often the sound of ignorance meeting innovation. That expertise in one context doesn't guarantee understanding in another. That traditional knowledge, developed over centuries of trial and error, deserves respect rather than dismissal. James Bradley learned this lesson personally, and to his credit, he taught it to others. In his later writings, he frequently referenced Lars's double roof as an example of what he called vernacular genius, the sophisticated problem-solving that emerges from sustained engagement with specific environmental challenges. We called him foolish, Bradley wrote in 1895, because we measured his solution against our assumptions rather than against the problem he was solving. His double roof seemed wasteful because we didn't understand what he was building. He wasn't building a roof. He was building a thermal shield. And once we understood that distinction, everything changed. The temperature difference, that 37-degree gap between Lars's cabin and his neighbors' homes, represented more than thermal efficiency. It represented the distance between arrogance and humility, between dismissing the unfamiliar and seeking to understand it. On the coldest night of January 1890, when temperatures plunged to minus 31 degrees and families huddled in frost-rimed cabins burning wood they couldn't spare, Lars Nieminen sat comfortably at 54 degrees, warm enough to work on his wood carvings. Not because he was lucky, not because he was wealthy, but because he understood something fundamental about physics that his expert neighbors had overlooked. The double roof wasn't magic. It was mathematics. It wasn't primitive. It was proven. And it worked exactly as Lars knew it would, because some knowledge doesn't need to be modern to be correct. It just needs to be true. Educational note. This script presents a historically plausible narrative based on documented frontier insulation techniques and thermal engineering principles. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. Any construction project should follow current building codes and consult qualified professionals.